Doke. So, we want to, I guess we can put subtitles on. Do you guys like subtitles or not so much? The captioning? They're okay, not great. Doesn't matter? Alright, we'll just leave them off for now. Okay, so we've been talking about all sorts of stuff, large scale things like geography, topography, topology, etc. Bedrock resources, soil, vegetation, water, and now wildlife. And this one's kind of front of mind for most people. When we think about places like national parks or state parks or wildlife refuges where recreation, in particular photography or hunting or fishing, extractive uses, are one of the main sets of reasons that bring people to protected areas for forest and outdoor rec, this gets a lot of pressure from kind of direct encounters, but also indirect habitat modification. So we'll talk about some of the characteristics of wildlife in terms of not so much the zoology, the management of healthy individual organisms or populations and subpopulation level management, and not so much from a forest habitat modification and management perspective. We got all of that in the entire major of zoology and across the various senior level classes in forestry. What we want to talk about for wildlife is, again, as with our other classes of resources, how do our recreationists think about how do we tend to use, how do we tend to affect or impact positively or negatively, and we do both with wildlife when we are doing forest and outdoor recreation, so that you can apply the other classes in terms of like forest resource management, forest measurement, stuff like that, anthropology, kind of all of everything, behavioral psych, understanding how your visitors are thinking about wildlife in specifically differently from you as the manager. There's a bunch of studies out there that illustrate how when you as a forester or park ranger coming from the human dimension side of stuff, like the people management side, your training changes the way that you think about it, that you see about it. The laws that you are trying to follow and satisfy, the policy and regulation that you're trying to honor as a forester or park ranger working in a public context or in a private or not-for-profit one, you're trying to keep all those things in mind. And visitors, not so much, right? They're there just to check out some cool wildlife. And so this is tricky stuff for the reasons we're about to run into. And the first and foremost reason is just that wildlife is cool to encounter. And so this is the stuff that has been marketed to people both actively by tourism organizations. Friends of the Shawnee National Forest, for example, is telling people about the wildlife on the Shawnee. And also sort of passively marketed when you think about like postcards you've seen about any of your favorite national parks, maybe that you've been to, Glacier or wherever. A lot of those big glossy photos, those coffee book tables, they're gonna have beautiful, beautiful photos, and you get DVDs or streaming videos of specifically the wildlife, because mountains are cool, but man, mountains plus bald eagles, sick, okay? So we wanna understand that the value that we place on wildlife as recreationists drives the motivation, which drives the behavior, okay? And those behaviors, again, can be good or bad, healthy or unhealthy for the wildlife, healthy or unsafe for the visitor, and good or bad for you as the manager involved as well. So we wanna kinda keep in mind that process or that chain of getting from what you and I think about wildlife all the way to how do we impact positively or negatively that wildlife. So that value, motivation, behavior chain is critically important, especially for wildlife, because we change how we behave, where we go, what we're doing, more with respect to wildlife than we do for things like vegetation resources. I know that's heresy in forestry department, but wildlife is cool. We'll talk about charismatic wildlife coming up. All right? Like, it's a cool moment to be walking through the snow in the forest and to come across a wolf track that is bigger than your hand, right? A lot of people, well, this is less so a thing now with Game of Thrones and people, seeing dire wolves and stuff like that. But wolves are really pretty big canids, and most folks are thinking without really rationally thinking about it. They're just kind of assuming a wolf is basically a wild dog, right? They are not the same thing. They're built pretty different. So it's important to think about seeing a video like this on social media. That's a baby elephant. A baby elephant going down a mudslide, having fun. This is a thing that elephants do. This is part of how they ford rivers, for example. And baby animals are cute, even when the baby animal is like the size of an oxen. And, what kid wouldn't resonate with that just kind of like intuitively, at a genetic level, okay? So, people see stuff like this. And then when we go to a park, most of our American national parks, maybe all of them, don't have baby elephants. But we see stuff like this and we think animals, they're just like us. That would be so cute to see something like that. Recently my wife and I went to Disney. We stayed at Animal Kingdom Lodge, and there's a bunch of like giraffes and kudu and okapi and water buffalo and the wildebeest, all the stuff that showed up in Lion King, in a zoo-like setting that's made to look fairly natural-ish in the enclosures, so you can, have your morning coffee on the balcony and watch a giraffe eating vegetation. That's a very curated, not natural setup or experience, but it sure is a cool one, and a lot of people pay a lot of money. Animal Kingdom Lodge is something like 800 or 900 rooms, and they fill them up like every day, all year round. So, this is a thing, right? Cute wildlife. We also want to think about how people think about nature, right? So this is a scorpion petting zoo. This is an old Far Side comic, which was a comic in a newspaper, which was things that people read when I was a kid. And Gary Larson has this sort of oddball sense of humor of, let's have a scorpion petting zoo. I mean, other petting zoos work, right? No problem there. So innovative concepts and exposing city kids to nature, right? There's this sense of this innate appeal. The existential value of wildlife is a lot more front and center than the existential value of grass. But grassoids and scorpions, they're both organisms in natural and human environments. We attach different intensity of value to them, though, right? So, functioning wildlife populations, integral to healthy ecosystems, and they are an irremovably important part of visitor experiences. If you've ever seen a picture of Smokey the Bear, you understand how much we have been marketed to about wildlife from the day we're born, okay? So, if you ask people pretty much anywhere, at any time of year, from any background, urban, rural, domestic, international, everybody says near or at the top of the list, why did you spend $1,000 just to get to such and such national park? They'll say, I wanted to see fill in the blank charismatic wildlife species. They don't care so much about the mosquitoes, weirdly enough, but mosquitoes are people too. It's always up at the top of the list. Doesn't matter what the weather is, doesn't matter what the location of the place is, people want to see the wildlife. And for good reason. Like, this is being on a sea kayaking trip and seeing a whale breach right next to your kayak, or in some hilarious cases right under it and lifting and throwing the kayak. Like, that's an experience. If you have this, even on just a neurochemical level, the adrenaline, the epinephrine that you are experiencing flooding your system more strongly writes the memory of this experience. Your brain speeds up to a faster clock cycle, if you want to think of it like a CPU, and slices time more thinly as you are experiencing this. It feels like time slows down into slow motion as this whale crashes, and these people are never going to forget this, right? For good reason. That's a really exciting, once in a lifetime, for most people, kind of a thing. But again, managers do definitely think about wildlife differently than the visitors. And the longer you're in the business, the more your views and your behaviors and so forth tend to diverge. And so there can become a disconnect between, oh my gosh, the visitors who are doing things that I really wish they wouldn't do because I know the inner texture of the impacts of their behaviors, versus me, the manager working on site, okay? So you and I, as trained people, as environmentally aware people, we see the fragile species that are not the charismatic wildlife, but that are critical to that ecosystem structure and function, okay? So it is very, very common for visitors to trample other organisms or trample those organisms' habitat in order to get to the more visible, more charismatic, the postcard species. So this is something we fundamentally have to keep in mind. Another reason that wildlife are sort of a more intensely handled resource versus other kinds of resources is that there's billion-dollar industries on a per-state basis. Like Wisconsin, for example, the hunting industry by itself is a multi-billion-dollar industry just in that state. And it's the same for most states. And it's even more than that in specific western states where hunting is a really, really big deal, like Wyoming and Colorado. There's real entire subcultures just focused on wildlife, right? So not just hunting, but innovating on shooting sports and hunting in order to be just that much more likely to have a successful hunting trip or fishing trip, stuff like that, okay? We don't see these same kinds of intensive subcultural dynamics around stuff like maple trees, right? Even though maple trees in a lot of places in the southern boreal forest are a critical part of the ecosystem, and critical to stuff like tourism in places like Vermont and New Hampshire, nobody's, repurposing World War II era machine guns for the purposes of viewing maple trees. We are doing stuff like this, applying military technologies to experiencing wildlife, and particularly in hunting or occasionally in poaching kinds of ways. But this is a really big deal, and people are willing to put real resources into it. So econometrics is the subdiscipline of economics and resource and wildlife management that uses economic techniques to put numbers to sort of amorphous values. Like, we all understand that ducks, waterfowl, snow geese, stuff like that, they're important. For those of us who are meat eaters, they're delicious. And it's a lot of fun to go snow geese hunting here in the Mississippi Flyway. So econometrics is a way to put dollar signs, dollar values onto how strongly people feel toward different intangible things. Like, if we're trying to get a sense of how important are ducks, like, where do we put those on our management efforts? This is one way to do it. Now, this is not a complete way to do it. If we reduce everything to dollars and cents, we're going to get those measurements not exactly right, and it's going to leave somebody's valuation out. Okay? We can't be thoroughly exhaustive, meaning we can't be thoroughly just and fair and equitable in those valuations. For example, with whitetail hunting here in Illinois, some people hunt whitetail and even poach whitetail in order not to starve. Other people hunt whitetail here in Illinois, coming up from places like Mississippi, to poach, because our whitetail are so much better than southern whitetail, like by a lot, in terms of just all sorts of things like general size and trophy buck quality and that sort of thing. So if we do an economic valuation or an econometric valuation, a willingness to pay exercise, for example, or a travel cost analysis, it's another econometric method. it's going to miss the people poaching that species in order to stay alive. But one way that this at least helps us get some kind of evaluation discussion going so that we can get some management work done. There's a billion of these studies. So Clayton and Mendelsohn in 1993, they asked folks, okay, so if you had a 50% chance at getting a bear tag, a black bear tag. So here in the eastern United States, black bear, not super common, but they are highly desirable for hunting. If you ever had bear stew, for example, it's super greasy, but delicious. First Nations folks use things like bear grease as an insect repellent. They essentially put it on like lotion. Bear have a lot of different, both instrumental values like insect repellent and also feeding people, and then just existential value, like it's important to me that healthy bear populations are present in Illinois where they are naturally supposed to be there. You can put numbers to that. So if you have a 10% chance, how much would you be willing to pay for a permit or tag to hunt black bear in Illinois? This is a non-trivial question because, you know, there's a limited number of bear available to take each year sustainably, and a lot of people want to do it. So this is how we start to put numbers on stuff like, should we have a permit? Should it be unregulated varmint style hunting, right? We run out of bears real fast in that case. Do we want to make the permit cost $1,000? Would you be willing to pay that for a guaranteed chance, or a 10% chance, or a 50% chance, or a 90% chance? And you get a whole bunch of these questions answered from a whole bunch of people, and you can figure out a fairly good and well-grounded or reasoned way to put a price on something that has no inherent or obvious price on it. So the fact that we can do this means that a lot of people, you have to have a lot of people who feel very strongly about a particular species. And we can use that strong feeling about that one maybe game species or highly desirable trophy species to help fund conservation for all of the other species wrapped up in the same kinds of habitats as that one species. So econometric tools, because people care about wildlife, means that we can get a whole bunch of other habitat, high quality habitat management done. Okay, so we also as managers see, hopefully we see more of the full picture. So this is a fox carcass deliquescing and being taken over by detritivorous maggots. And this is gross to a lot of people, but to a wildlife biologist, this is super important, you know? Like, this is how resources get cycled, how nutrients get cycled through the system. So to the extent that this isn't happening, that's a problem. We place a value on this as managers. Visitors, they want somebody to take care of this and shovel it up and move it somewhere else, or throw it in a dumpster, or just fix the glitch, to quote the movie Office Space. Okay? We see and deal with all the species that folks don't prefer to. Now, crocodiles and alligators maybe not the best example because they check some of the boxes for charismatic species characteristics, but in places even like Disney, where I was talking about earlier about Animal Kingdom, there's a little kid that was killed by an alligator. This is probably 10 years ago now. As the parents and like the whole family and hundreds of other people were attending just some event that Disney had organized at one of their lodges, which was built in the former Florida swamp before that area was filled in and turned into resorts and stuff like that. And the gator wasn't doing anything it's not normally doing, right? It's just trying to eat. But managers see that differently than visitors who might tend to see a less desirable predator species, a reptilian predator species, as anathema, something that just doesn't have any exciting or positive value and it's just a negative one. Okay, so we gotta as managers, see all of the species present. It's a little bit washed out here, but there are shark species present here, and it is a keystone species for marine ecosystems the world over. So the question becomes, what is our recreation interface with the species, especially the species that visitors aren't paying attention to? We got to pay attention to those because it's very, very easy in an intensive recreation, popular, busy recreation setting to just steamroll through lots of species that people aren't trying to think about. Okay? So, we are managing species by habitats. Generally, here as park rangers, as resource rangers, as habitat management specialists, we are focusing on habitat management as much or more than we are focusing on managing the actual organisms of that species. Because we can't force a bison or elk herd to reproduce in a great way. We can exercise excellent control over their prairie and woodland habitat and create the situation for them to be successful in that breeding and reproduction. Okay? So, we do have park biologists, park zoologists, who are at times doing things like tracking the spread of brucellosis, for example, through bison, and making sure that they're not spreading it to nearby cattle operations, which would involve a total herd cull. You have to kill and discard that entire herd once it gets infected. We're not so much working on that in forestry. We're focusing on the habitat. So we're going to be talking about wildlife, but our day-to-day ops are generally going to be managing habitats, habitat improvement, impact reduction, mitigation, stuff like that. Okay? So let's talk about, just a quick reminder, a couple of different key types of habitat: feeding, breeding and rearing, cover and denning, and then to that we'll add corridor and travel habitats. And we'll see later on, each of these can interface with recreation in occasionally good ways, but usually really pretty deleterious or negative or harmful ways. All right, so for feeding habitat, we're gonna see a lot of predator species where there tend to be fewer individual organisms because it's a predator species versus a primary producer species, or a prey species, or like a mesovore sort of a thing, partway up the food chain or food web. This is often where we see wildlife moving actively, doing things that we saw on Marty Stauffer's Wild America, if you're as old as I am, or on any of the bazillion nature documentaries narrated by David Attenborough these days. Because the hunting behaviors of the wildlife, they're active, they're out and moving. We can have a much better chance of seeing them versus, hiding away or sleeping or hibernating in torpor in their denning habitat underground, for example, or in a tree hollow. Okay, so feeding habitats, we're going to have a lot of wildlife encounters, which is going to draw a lot of visitors, and drawing a lot of visitors could mean trampling out that habitat and reducing that habitat's quality. So, especially in parks, which tend to focus on high-quality core habitat, but high-quality core habitat that is potentially a much higher elevation gradient, a park draped across a mountain range, for example. Okay? In the upper reaches of that mountain range, not useful feeding habitat for larger organisms like bears. They're down in the bottoms, feeding on fish or berries, trying to get those calories in however they can, however they need to, within whatever season is available to them. Okay? So, in a place like Denali National Park up in Alaska, the wildlife has about 2.5 to 3 months each year of time between the spring thaw and the first hard killing frost, hard freeze in early August. So they got a couple of months to store up calories for like the rest of the year. And after that, it gets cold again, and they have to start spending more calories, raising that basal metabolic rate to stay warm, to finish off that last desperate feeding, and then try and lower that metabolic rate and make it through the entire rest of the year. Okay, so that feeding activity, critically important for the survival of these species. This particular study within zoology is called energetics. What's the calorie budget of each individual grizzly or brown bear or Kodiak or polar bear is another species where this is thrown into sharp relief. To the extent that visitors are encountering these and then sort of harassing them or driving them away from good feeding habitat, or just costing them time, that's time that some of these species may not have, and if they don't get above that minimum hurdle for survival, they're going to starve to death over the winter. That's a hell of a way to go. There is a yet higher calorie minimum threshold to clear if that species is trying to reproduce and maintain population viability. And pretty much all wildlife species are trying to do that, right? So we have, in some cases, not a lot of margin for error in making sure that they are able to maintain basal metabolic rate, body temperature regulation, stuff like that, okay? And because they don't have tents like we do, think about the calories that this, in this case, African species is, they're spending more calories to stay warm when wet, okay? We lose heat up to 100 times faster when our bodies are wet. Now, in sub-Saharan Africa, hypothermia, not really a huge concern. But in a lot of the parks where you've chosen to study a little bit more in depth this semester, you do have some high elevation and or some high latitude settings where, yeah, it's not hard to freeze to death at all, okay? So, the short feeding season for high latitude, high elevation places means that we're going to have some difficulty in some of these places interfacing our wildlife with visitors. Our visitors, again, are showing up for specifically this wildlife viewing, among other things, okay? So, increased foraging rates bring predator and prey species into contact and add humans into the mix, and it changes that dynamic. So predation can be actually enhanced by the presence of humans. For example, in a campground, we see people coming in and leaving crumbs. And so those crumbs cause an absolute explosion of small rodentia, field mice, voles, squirrels, birds, stuff like that. And very commonly, the usual expected pattern is we get a whole bunch of rodents, which might get the people very sick. We'll talk about that later as an impact. And we get an explosion in predatory snakes, feeding on all those extra rodents, okay? So now we have snakes in contact with and actively out and feeding around, like your kid's pup tent, for example, in the campground, because 3 visitors ago, they left a whole bunch of bread out or the ravens, swooped down, grabbed a couple of slices of bread. One of the slices of bread fell on the forest floor nearby, and the mice find that, okay? So we want to think about this, kind of what happens when somebody leaves crumbs at a site. What are the first order effects of that? Second order, third order effects, all right? Cool. So predation spreads or kind of moves that calorie energy from herbivores through mesivores to apex predators, and this is how energy cycles through the ecosystem. And moving people into that cycling or that chain of calorie transfer can muck things up pretty hard. So with prey species like elk, for example, their flight radius, we'll talk about what that is later, their flight radius is about a mile. So for a wild elk population, if you bring visitors within a mile, 1,600 yards, and they're upwind, those visitors are starting to hard impact the calorie gathering efforts, the young rearing and protection against predators like wolves efforts of that entire herd. And the people may not even be aware of the elk, right? If they're a mile away and halfway behind a ridge where you don't have just direct line of sight to them, but they can smell you, they are starting to move. They are stopping feeding and displacing elsewhere, okay? So we can interrupt the flow of calories through species or across space by introducing recreation, okay? So the wintertime is when this gets thrown into like real serious mode. So think about what winter in central Wyoming is really like. It's not just kind of cold and snowy, it's a lot cold and snowy. Yellowstone National Park, for example, is a high elevation plateau with drift snow. Yellowstone can get 6-foot drift snow in storms as late as Memorial Day. That actually screwed us on summer camp one year. I was going to take everybody to Yellowstone and it was going to be amazing. Then we got a call from the ranger saying, hey, I saw you guys have your reservation to come camping in a week here. We just got 6 feet of snow. It was like the first week of May when I got this phone call. And camp was starting the next day. And so the ranger said, we're not even going to try to plow these roads out until June. So we're canceling your reservation. And I was like, thank you very much for your time. All right, everybody, let's rip out our summer camp plans from day one through the last day and plan a completely different trip on day one. And we did it. But all that to say, we were able to plan around that and go somewhere warmer. We went down to the Grand Canyon and had a great time. The bison that are at Yellowstone, up on that plateau, migrating up there for their summer feeding habitat, up from the lower river terraces at Grand Teton National Park, where they overwinter. They're stuck in 6-foot drift snow, and yeah, it's a lot of calories to post hole as a bison and break trail and paw out all that 6 feet of snow to try and get anything that is just starting to come up as fresh green vegetation. It's hard to keep your young alive, your calves, in that regime, okay? So wintertime is when the rubber hits the road, so to speak. So it takes a lot of calories to get a few calories when you have to browse and stuff like this, okay? And the reason I bring up Yellowstone is that over winter, this was a very famous set of studies done over the course of about 15 years at Yellowstone. Researchers found that snowmobiles at Yellowstone, which you could rent and just, go driving 40, 50, 60 miles an hour through those 6-foot snow drifts. I mean, it's a lot of fun. Think about like off-road motorcycling, but no bumps. That was startling nearby herds of elk and bison and causing them to move away in some cases a panic. So like a stampede but through snow. I mean, spending thousands and thousands of calories every day just to get away from snow machines that weren't in actual danger but were perceived as a danger by those wildlife species, and they were starving to death one after the other. To the extent that the Park Service had to step in and say, no snowmobiling, we can't do this, we just can't sustain it. It is lethally dangerous in terms of energetics and spending those calories, okay? The reason that those snow machines were so dangerous to wildlife populations was because of their noise pollution, sound pollution. And snow is usually actually a pretty good ablator or absorber of sound. If you've ever been hiking in the snow, it's a very quiet and peaceful and serene kind of a thing, as long as you're bundled up and all of that. But for all of the species around you with a whole bunch of noise pollution, that can interfere with things like hunting or signaling to their fellow organisms in that acoustic niche that danger is nearby and so forth. It'd be like you shouting to a classmate, hey, there's somebody dangerous outside, but the air conditioner is so loud that they can't hear what you're saying, and then somebody gets hurt by the person who's dangerous and outside. Okay? So, A lot of species are very sensitive to that kind of a sound, and it causes lots of issues with declining population vigor or health, or even population individuals or size. Okay, so mobile carnivores, apex predators, they need lots and lots of space. A black bear, which is not huge in the world of bears, a single mature male black bear needs 100 square miles of solo habitat to support itself. If you've ever gone to Great Smoky Mountains National Park, you know that there can be, in some places, a lot more than one bear per 10 mile by 10 mile square on the map. There can be lots of bears. But in nature, these guys need huge home range, interior range space to do their thing. And to the extent that we are driving our snow machines or breaking trail with our telemark skis or whatever, we are carving up that habitat. Okay, so we can deal with this. In kind of the opposite end of the spectrum, where things are very, very hot, animals are effectively cut off from habitat when the heat is too high. Typically, nutrient density in the soil in hot areas is very poor, because hot rainwater is better at washing nutrients out to the ocean than cold rainwater is. And as a result, you gotta work harder. There's less stuff growing with less nutrient density in hotter areas, which is also a concern for human agriculture as in the midst of climate change. There's less calorie density in the stuff that's growing where it's hotter or heating up. It just means they gotta move more when they really don't want to, and they have to rely much more heavily on what can be dwindling water holes, for example, in the case of this African elephant. Okay, so where we are forcing, this is a reenactment, I'm pretty sure. You can tell by the way it is. Where we have desert obligate species, our recreation can be hugely impactful. A single incursion or trip or visit can be enough to cause a localized collapse of small rodents living in middens, or these, like pack rats, for example, living in these areas of a single burrow that is its own sort of ecosystem unto itself. It's a really cool thing. Okay, so water sources in those arid areas, like the African savanna or the veldt, those watering holes, all the creatures come together around the watering hole. And in the arid southwest of the United States, it's the same thing. We don't have white lions at the southwest of the United States, except for where, was that the tiger king, dies and accidentally releases a whole bunch of whatever. Moving on. Feeding habitat size for your mobile airborne species is a particularly difficult problem to manage, because they don't have to respect your borders, so to speak, at the edge of the park. You can fence in other kinds of wildlife if that is an ecologically appropriate and sustainable thing to do. It is the absolutely wrong thing to do at places like Yellowstone, where we fenced all the bison in out of all the ranches nearby, and they all started freezing to death up on that high plateau over the winter. So we created and hooked Grand Teton National Park as overwinter habitat to rejoin the bison with their overwinter habitat so they could survive. But for osprey, for eagles, for other raptors, there are very, very difficult habitat management problems. Peregrine falcons nesting in bridge towers on cliff lines at Acadia National Park, for example. They are hunting and fishing, in the case of the falcons or the osprey. And we don't always have strict direct control over those things. So in some cases, being a wildlife respecting park ranger means that you need to work very closely with humans that don't have to work very closely with you. Does that make sense? You're working with all the neighbors, all of them, because these guys and gals can go kind of anywhere. Okay, so that means we need to be managing other areas and forming partnerships in a way that we don't typically need to form partnerships to protect things like our soil, our vegetation species. We do sometimes have to for water quality because, right, a lot of our watersheds, upper watersheds, are outside of our park and then flowing water into or through a park. But wildlife definitely pushes us outside of sometimes our introverted forester comfort zone. We got to interface with folks and set up things like Friends of the Shawnee National Forest, Friends of Acadia National Park. Most every park has at least one Friends of type group to help with this interfacing with local business folks, like the bald eagles in and around Acadia National Park. Tour boats, whale watching tours had to be modified in order to protect the ability of bald eagles to fish and the peregrine falcon there to fish. It was a lot of tricky and slow work, unfortunately, and the wildlife were responding to the impacts very quickly, so it's tough. All right? But there is typically a chance, at least, of addressing these problems before they get to a total population collapse type phase. And for those that don't address the problem before it gets to collapse, as with bison, as with the bald eagle, as with peregrine falcons, the Park Service and other organizations like it, they are part of the vanguard of breeding and reintroduction programs to try and bring these back. Forest Service does a ton of stuff with bison as well, as the primary range management agency in the United States federally. So this is a thing. It is tricky. So this is a peregrine falcon, fastest natural creature on the face of the earth. They can dive at up to 255 miles per hour. That is the speed of an race car or a Formula One type racer. Pretty cool stuff. But they have very specific habitat needs, both in terms of feeding like this and breeding and rearing with cliff top nests. So it takes a federal agency level effort to provide both of those and provide them at reasonable quality. All right, but we gotta think again. We gotta pull back from those charismatic species and watching. If you've never seen a bald eagle fishing over water, we may see some this weekend with our field trip at Ozark Scenic Riverways. It's a majestic thing. Like, that's a memorable thing. I've seen a lot of bald eagles at Ozark Scenic Riverways. No promises, but we commonly encounter them there, and that's a good thing. It's a sign of success. But again, we're not just talking about, we can't just talk about those charismatic species like our national bird. We also have to talk about the not so national not birds like moths, butterflies, dragonflies as indicator species, and so forth. Okay, so that's feeding habitat. We also have mating and rearing habitat. And I mean, you can avert your eyes. I understand, like, this is awkward, but you know, they got to do the nasty. And this requires an absolutely huge commitment and risk from the perspective of the breeding pairs or the breeding and rearing organisms. Like, if they are trying to keep an eye on their young, they're splitting that attention between feeding themselves, feeding the young, looking for predators, and so forth. And so it's just a lot of risk, and it's a very uncertain reward. Okay. We've all seen, like, the nature documentaries where, you know, the wolves are stalking the elk and they stampede the herd and they try to separate out the bigger but sickly ones and the young, because those are easier to take down than, you know, a mature, healthy adult bull elk. And that means the young are nice juicy targets, right? So I'm sure some of us can relate. You know, mating success is not at all a for sure thing. A lot of species are pretty finicky about you know, consenting properly and bringing things to fruition, so to speak. Tropical birds are, in particular, are, some of them are just trying to die. Like, I can kind of relate though, you know, like, If you've ever been walking across campus and just been assaulted with like a cloud of Axe body spray, I'm pretty sure that's like a pre-mating display for the human species. I don't know. I'm old and boring and married, so I don't know about any of this stuff. All right. And our noise pollution in parks is, as it's turning out, a major contributor to mating failure, especially among audible species. Mating song is a really important function for a lot of species, and so when we get 10,000 people a day or 10,000 vehicles a day through a place like Rocky Mountain National Park, which has big open valleys and elevated highways, if you get a single modified pipe motorcycle where they've drilled through the exhaust so it's super loud, 130, 140 decibels, that kind of thing, like up there next to a jet engine in terms of sound pressure or volume level, that one modified pipes motorcycle we found in a study a while back at Rocky can effectively lock out species over more than 100 square miles of habitat inside Rocky Mountain National Park in certain places where the motorcycle is high and perched over a valley, just fills the whole valley with noise. And that's one person's safety measure. A loud bike is a safe bike, but it's also causing everybody else to not be able to get their dip-ins on, or whatever the youth call it these days. Okay? So, what we are trying to protect is this. Let's see if I can get my volume up all the way here. You guys can hear that? So it's about this loud. This is a dawn chorus. Most songbird species join the dawn chorus and the dusk chorus, a crepuscular, as our zoologists would call it, life way. And this is at Land Between the Lakes in 2021. So this would have been early summer, about 6:30 in the morning. And for those of you who have been camping in the Midwest, this can feel pretty loud. But when you pull out a sound meter, this is something like 25, 30 decibels of total sound pressure, the actual vibrational energy of the sound waves hitting your eardrum, hitting their eardrums, or auditory meatus, or whatever wetware we have for perceiving sound. 25 to 30 decibels is 20 decibels less than the air conditioning unit on top of every single one of these days, the RVs in the campground at Land Between the Lakes. So we'll talk more about soundscapes and sound impacts later on, but the basic idea is if you have something that's louder, the human ear at least cannot hear something that is softer. So if you have something at 10,000 hertz, a certain pitch, two sounds at that same pitch, the louder one completely wipes out our ability to perceive or be aware of the softer one, even if it's just like very slightly louder. So when you have something that's 20 decibels louder, like an AC unit on somebody's RV, versus this, well, all of the songbirds respond and try to compete with that. It's a territoriality display, among other things. And so the mating's not going to happen, the territory marking, the hazard marking, predator marking is not going to happen around that AC unit. And at places like LBL, there are literally hundreds of RVs present during the peak season. So that whole area becomes acoustically unavailable. There's still food calories there, there's still mating and rearing habitat there, but the ability to communicate at those acoustic niches, at those pitches and cadences, is wiped out by our need for a little bit of AC. Okay? So, here's a similar dawn chorus at White Mountains National Forest. This one's about 20 decibels. Okay, 20 decibels is about equivalent to one person walking carefully and slowly through leaf litter on the forest floor. So if somebody's just walking out there, not even saying anything, not using one of those like Bluetooth speakers and like blasting their music all over the forested landscape as some hikers like to do, no judgment, but it does interfere with wildlife, mating, rearing. Just somebody walking through the leaves is enough to blanket that area. And the sound levels fall off with distance, of course, but in that area around that person, that's a non-functional habitat for those songbirds while that person is there. Does that make sense? All right, so think about what's the busiest trail at the national park you've selected this semester. What fraction of the day does it have hikers who are making sounds or noises? Noises are negatively evaluated sounds. Above 20 decibels. Is that 6 a.m. to 6 p.m.? Is it maybe every once in a while, maybe some days for a less busy, less popular trail? But whatever the worst case scenario is for that trail, that's what all the wildlife in that area that relies on soundscape, that's what it has to overcome. All right, so habitats for vulnerable wildlife species. We can't force the sea turtles to be successful, and only about 1 in 1,000 hatchlings are going to survive to adulthood, so this is tough. We can manage their habitats. We can literally shut down beaches. We can slap people with huge fines for trying to steal turtle eggs to sell the hatchlings on the black market, as happens. We can slap absolutely ginormous fines on real jackwagons who take their four-wheelers on the beach, which is a fun thing to do, but they'll sort of ride right over nests and crush, 100 eggs at a time. Each nest is up to about 100 eggs for the species. So, yeah, plastic litter, here we go. All right, so the youth of the species, super vulnerable to impacts of all kinds, and even just with natural predation and the difficulty of being just a hatchling in the open ocean, this is a 1/10% chance that this little guy or gal is going to make it to adulthood. 1/10%. It takes 10 successful nests and hatchings to produce one turtle that survives. Okay? It's a good thing they live a long time and they can reproduce many times over. But that's what we're looking at. Okay? Out in the wild, without picking a particular wildlife species, there's about a 40 to 50% chance that any individual wildlife organism is going to be eaten alive by another one. So it's nasty out there. It's hard to survive if you are wildlife. 40 to 50% chance. Okay? So, time spent mating and rearing, in this case, is time not spent doing everything else. So it's a zero-sum game. Every minute you take from feeding, every minute you take from transiting or migrating to do stuff like this, you have to do stuff like this, otherwise the population collapses, is time lost from either of those critical activities. So, for the human wildlife species, mating and rearing also a thing in a recreation context. Okay? And this is something that park rangers occasionally have to deal with. Alright, so story time real quickly. I was on a study at C&O Canal National Historic Park in Washington, D.C. And we were doing a blinded study of, like, literally sitting in a blind and observing folks as they were walking along a particular section of a trail called the Billy Goat Section A Trail. It's a non-technical rock scramble type trail that people love to just go from their capital jobs, like being an assistant or staffer for a legislator or something like that. This is a great place to go, like, walk for a half an hour for lunch or something like that. It's a very, very busy and popular trail, but it's also a fairly technical trail. People get hurt here all the time because it's rocky and rugged, and Potomac River right there, when it floods 80 feet straight upward and then covers this trail. It's a channelized river with cliffs on both sides. And So we're sitting there, and our goal with this research study is to figure out what kinds of signs, like information signs, wayfinding signs, like reassurance markers, like this is the trail, go this way, kind of thing. Fencing, or just like scree lines, meaning lines of rocks in a row marking the edge of the trail. Does that help people stay on the trail? Because there's a whole bunch of really, really fragile amphipod and isopod insect communities. Like insects or freshwater arthropods. They're like tiny little shrimp, each about the size of the tip of a pencil. And super fragile, super rare, and their habitat just looks like a mud puddle in the middle of the forest. People walking right through and killing them all. So how we use signs or trail design to keep people on the trail and away from this super critical habitat and fragile species. So we're sitting in a hidden spot overlooking the trail and just seeing which signs work, which ones don't, right? Some things are going to work better than others, but we just needed to figure out which would work better in that particular context. And a young, amorous couple walking down the trail, and they're giggling at each other, and they're all lovey-dovey. And it's like, oh, this is nice, right? They're on trail. Check. Oh, nope, they walked off trail, and they came off the trail right next to our line, about 15 feet away. And then the sounds were not cutesy and lovey-dovey. It was like sounds, like the sounds you hope you never hear from your parents' bedroom when you're a kid. And it was awkward, and it didn't last that long, but it was, it was a couple really awkward minutes for me as a researcher there. So we have to think about humans considering recreation spaces as mating and rearing habitat as well. So what are the habitat needs of the human organism for keeping their children safe or for making children? Okay? Like, this is never not going to be a thing in public places, unfortunately, as well as more private spaces like people's own homes. But if we don't consider this and where folks are likely going to want to do this sort of a thing, they're going to do it kind of anywhere they feel like it. So part of our habitat management is managing this habitat for human needs as well. Okay? All right. So that's mating and rearing habitat, including for humans. They left their underwear behind afterwards, and I was like, I am not cleaning that up, even though it's technically litter. Okay. Moving on. I'm clearly still, I've probably talked to a counselor or something, like it stayed with me, All right. Cover and denning habitat. Humans really, really, really change cover and denning habitat for wildlife species, okay? So, can anybody see the problem here with forest and outdoor recreation with cover habitat as provided and modified by humans for recreation purposes? A snake sees that space differently than we do, right? But it's a perfectly logical idea for the snake. It's nice and warm. It's got a little shelf over the top of it, the back end of the saddle. Like, this is a pretty good idea for the snake. Terrible idea for the rider. And all of this only exists because we think as humans that riding a horse is fun. Trail riding on a horse in a place like the Shawnee National Forest is lots of fun. It supports dozens of businesses here in Southern Illinois, right? Here in Southern Illinois, we have the Snake Road on the Shawnee National Forest, and it can bring people in contact with not aggressive snakes, not dangerous snakes. It's not a dangerous place, but occasionally humans acting in not so smart ways turn the Snake Road, for example, into a dangerous encounter for themselves, and even more importantly, a dangerous encounter for the wildlife. Wildlife are just trying to migrate up out of the bottomland to den for the winter, or down to the bottomland to have a nice, cool and food-rich habitat. So, when animals are trying to just be in their habitat and humans show up and get a little too close, maybe in this case not even realizing that there's a bird on top of this because they're pretty well naturally camouflaged, right? Like, my brain doesn't see that and think bird, and then it flies away, you know? So we don't recognize very commonly as recreationists that we are transgressing into habitat. And that causes either low-key displacement or evasion. Evasion is high speed. We'll get into different behavioral responses of wildlife to human impacts and presence of behaviors in a later class session, maybe on Wednesday. Okay? So we have alert, alarm, displacement, evasion, food attraction, aggression, and habituation. 7 different wildlife behavioral responses to humans. More on that later. Okay? And when you displace wildlife by approaching it on purpose or just on accident, you didn't realize it was there, when wildlife moves away, they're moving to a lower quality habitat because they're already in the higher quality habitat because it's got more calorie density or better cover habitat characteristics or better mating opportunities, right? That's why they're there. So when we force them to displace or evade, it's either a low speed or a high speed trip to a lower quality place, and we've interrupted whatever their life maintenance behavior was. Okay? So it's not the one time that we scare a bird off of its perch, like that common potu. It is this happening over and over and over again at your national park, which might have 1 million visitors a year, or hundreds of thousands of visitors a year, or 10,000 visitors walking by a single trailhead every single day. 10,000 people encountering some wildlife. That wildlife's having a pretty bad day. Yeah? Even if 0% of those 10,000 people are throwing rocks at that individual wildlife organism, that's still 10,000 people that wildlife has to kind of low-key keep an eye on, just in case. Because every once in a while, somebody is going to try and throw a rock, you know? So from the wildlife's perspective, it's all downside to have that much disturbance. Okay? So it is up to multiple disturbances per hour. Imagine if you were trying to get your feeding or sleep or mating on, and you were interrupted multiple times an hour by your dog or your cat, right? That's a frustration. It's funny at first, and then it's like, no, but I really gotta sleep. Or no, I really gotta study, or no, I really gotta eat this pizza. I can't be dealing with this dog continuously. But from the wildlife perspective, that's the lived experience, okay? So, the issue here is that we have some folks who are gonna do the right thing for the right reasons, and they're gonna try to help other people understand what's going on. It's a very pro-social, as it's called, approach, right? I know the right thing to do. I'm going to help somebody who doesn't know what the right thing to do is, help them to do it as well, and we're both going to have a really positive interaction, and somebody's going to learn something today. That's a really good pro-social thing. And then for the large majority of people, they don't have a forestry degree or wildlife or whatever degree that you have, and they just don't realize. They think it's cool or funny when the squirrel is sitting on their leg and eating a Cheeto that you give them. So, the problem isn't the pro-social, highly educated, or aware folks, people behaving well. It's kind of the center of mass of people who are just kind of there, you know? And that's most people. So, that can lead to a whole bunch of displacement like this. It can lead to other kinds of encounters as well. Like, you don't want to be this visitor, you know? Any of you guys see the movie Cocaine Bear? All right, we're going to talk about Cocaine Bear this semester. That's something. And finally, we've got migration and quarter habitat modification. So this is unfortunately one of the big ones for us. We can preserve, we can keep humans out of core key habitat for species of note in your park. right? So if camping and hiking are incompatible with certain species survival, close that area off. Close down those trails, remove that campground, only issue permits to camp there during the off season when everybody's underground hibernating safely, or whatever. We can manage that stuff. Unfortunately, when we're cutting in roads and trails, and lots of national parks have lots and lots of miles of forest roads and trails, the Forest Service operates 250,000 miles of forest roads, one of the largest road management organizations in the world. It's just a lot of forest roads, and pretty much all that is through habitat for something or something else. Okay, so some of these we can handle pretty well. We can manage problematic visitor behaviors around these others, but we gotta have, or we think we gotta have, roads and trails and boat ramps and all of our transportation infrastructure resources, and our wildlife are gonna respond to that, because for some that's habitat fragmentation, and for others that's a really nice road to use themselves. So, that is absolutely a thing. Let's take a look at corridor use. Let's see. Direct migration corridor changes. All right, so this was a short video that made it all the way around the world. I believe this is in Russia originally. And it's like, oh my God, the little baby cub is stuck. You see how the snowplow created an obstacle. And it's not a very big obstacle, but it's big enough for that cub. Which means that the sow, the bear mother here, has to engage in a defensive charge against the vehicle. Right? This is one of the most dangerous kinds of wildlife encounters. If you ever find yourself between a bear and her cub or cubs, take quick stock of your life, agree with yourself you've had a good run, because it's over. All right? This is one of the few times that bears are genuinely pretty likely to rough you up. All right? So, let's see here. What are some others? Yeah. There's a beautiful bull elk chilling and eating. So this is feeding habitat here in the pinyon juniper woodland of Mather Campground at Grand Canyon National Park. And that elk, I don't know if you can really see it, but it's got a huge crown of antlers. I mean, like full size in velvet. This is getting towards fully ready to go for the rut. Still got a couple of months, but pretty big rack. Okay. This bull elk is able to get around to this awesome high calorie density open edge woodland habitat by virtue of the fact that Mather Campground is an enormous campground. It's hundreds and hundreds of sites. Okay. So this is the thing. We cut Mather Campground in. We passively enrich the amount of calories present by providing all of those pinyon pines, making tens of thousands of pinyon pine nuts per tree as a food source for the elk. And the elk migrate or flock to this feeding habitat because humans cut a campground into it and indirectly modified it for the positive effect of providing more calories. So here's a cow elk the same year. It's about 10 meters away.
All right,
30 feet is really close for a cow elk human encounter. Remember when I said that in the wild, they'll start moving away from you at 1 mile? This is like 32 feet, okay? So, this can be okay. This can also lead to the elk figuring out, man, if I slurp up that power bar that somebody left behind, well, that's a whole lot of calories. What am I dealing with pine nuts for? This tastes really good. It's got really strong synthetic flavors added to it. I'm gonna eat this thing. Ooh, and that crinkly wrapper, gives a little crunchy extra bit to it. And then that wrapper forms a foil ball in their gut, and they starve to death from gut obstruction and blockage. So this is a thing. Let's see. Lions using human roads. We would call this a lion jam, a certain kind of traffic jam. Or elk and caribou jams. Let's see, coyoting using trails at Rocky Mountain National Park. I didn't film the coyote, but that's coyote poops. In the middle of a very popular trail. That's the Glacier Gorge Trail, for those of you keeping track. Elephants using human roads. You get the idea. Same thing with trails in the backcountry, although it's a little bit less common to find a bunch of videos of that for the obvious reason. Okay, so for pretty much every kind of habitat and for every motile species, we have to ask hard questions about, okay, I want to put in this awesome trail network. What about when that elk who's trying to get from point A to point B around us can save thousands of calories per day by using human transportation structure, like broken snow trail, okay? This is a big deal. This can mean the difference between survival and failure. So we gotta wrestle with that. It's a pretty big deal, all right? Good deal. All right, let's pause our discussion there for a bit, and come back to all of that, and we will